All right, everybody, we're back. It's Brigadoon Radio. We're back from our summer break. We're back from, I don't know. We're back from, I don't know where we're back from, but we're back. Here we are. Oh my gosh, Gerald, what a time to come back. To me, the world is cracked. We have a new PM, a new monarch. Arsenal's at the top of the table. Liverpool's sinking. The Lions start their football season this weekend. Oh my gosh, what a time to be back. How are you doing? What's happening?
I'm fine. I think I may have bored people at the last edition 3 weeks ago saying I went off to have some hip surgery, which I've done. So I now have one piece of me that's only a few weeks old instead of many decades old. I probably have to have the rest of me done at some stage. But no, it's all gone well. And as is the case with these things, one tends to sing the praises of doctors and nurses. But no, I'm very happy with that. We've been away during what I always call the silly season, when we have lots of stupid stories that turn out to be exactly that. There were fewer this year. There was a slightly eccentric one of the British Labour Party leader wearing combat fatigues over his business suit for a photo opportunity. That looked slightly odd. But my favourite every year is North Korea starting World War III, and that's not happened. So,
well, but apparently getting to North Korea, I haven't read this. I've seen a headline though, but they've changed their constitution or whatever governs the kingdom there, that they can preemptively use nuclear weapons, which I don't mean to laugh, but that seems a little aggressive.
Yeah, but I suppose I could announce I could preemptively use them, but whether I've got them and could do it is another matter. And as you always say, aspiration is very different from execution. Though we shouldn't belittle these guys too much, but and it must still be a top item in the in tray of any US president, and for Japan and China for that matter.
Well, yeah, we shouldn't be too late. You're spot on. But where should we start? I'm pleased that your surgery went well. I'm pleased that you have a new hip, possibly training for the Tour de France 2023. Is that on the agenda now?
I'm only going to watch this documentary when it comes out and watch these lunatics do these sort of 45-degree, and not even get out of the saddle. There you go.
So where should we start? I'll leave it up to you, since we're at the end of the silly season. We're out the back to school season. Should we do a pop quiz, or what are you feeling?
Well, I obviously I've got the talking stick here, so it's inevitable we're going to talk about the handover of monarchs and prime ministers. But let's not make it too Anglo-centric. And I think it would be quite interesting to get your take on the early stages of the lineup for the US elections later in the autumn. And the other one that's going on, which everybody pretty much is aware of, but is this big meeting of the Chinese Communist Party, and whether President Xi is going to seal the deal and get his absolutely overwhelming position in place, and whether that's really what it seems. So maybe we go for those three. What's your stateside perception of what's going on with new monarchs and prime ministers?
Well, I think it's a bit of I don't know, maybe I'm too close to it, and I obviously am obsessed with government, and I love what's happening in the UK overall. But I was a bit struck that, the flags in the US at every outpost, every government building, every consulate, every embassy have been lowered to half staff until internment. That's going to be 10, 12 days. I mean, that's pretty striking. I was actually quite surprised, not out of respect. I mean, obviously, I think plenty of people respect the Queen for her longevity, her service. That's a pretty bold thing. I'm not sure what other country or what other leader would get that kind of respect in the United States. I mean, to literally, almost stop what we're doing. Even last night at Yankee Stadium, before they started the ball game, on the Jumbotron, there was, like a moment of silence. I mean, it's pretty remarkable. And I think it's a credit to her. And maybe it's not fully appreciated in London, the impact the Queen has had. I'm not so sure it's the monarchy itself, but the Queen, the longevity is what's quite interesting.
Yeah, I think you're right. In this case, it is the individual rather than the institution. I saw, this is a second-hand story, but I saw a story on Twitter yesterday evening that some guy was in a restaurant in Paris, and the news came over, and Le Patron sort of alerted everybody, and they all stood up and had a minute's silence in a restaurant in Paris. Now that is quite extraordinary. She was very popular in France and went there a lot because she was, I think it's true to say, she was pretty popular in the United States. She used to make a lot of private visits to the United States because she was very keen on horse racing and all that sort of Kentucky breeding of horses and all the rest of it. I think you're right. In the UK, we're kind of looking internally, but she, I think, is a genuinely global figure. And you look at other recent global figures, the only one that comes close for me would probably be Nelson Mandela. Maybe.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
And in my lifetime, maybe, I don't know. I mean, I think I was only 7 or 8, but at the time of the death of Churchill, I imagine the American reaction then might have been pretty strong. But I don't know. He's had an American mother and all the history of the Second World War and everything. But it's still a very remarkable thing that you say about flags and all the rest of it.
Well, I think it's interesting. This comes on the heels of, the Tories having their leadership contest. Liz Truss gets named prime minister, and then 48 hours later, we have a new monarch. I mean, that to me is quite shocking. I'm interested that the leadership race actually went the distance. I'm not sure why Rishi didn't drop out sooner. Liz Truss, it does seem that is coming in under a bit of a shadow. I mean, with not Churchill, sorry. That was but Boris Johnson is there. And as I was talking about today, like, he's like a piece of luggage, he's like just lurking in the backgrounds. And he's, in some ways, is going to be Truss's, I think, biggest problem. Boris unleashed. And then you now have this monarch situation. Does this help Liz Truss? Does it hurt her? I don't know. Maybe it does help her, right? It gives her time to get her sea legs and focus on the bigger things.
This might be slightly cynical, but it kind of takes the headlamps off her, which probably suits, because she's got some very big hurdles with energy policy and people screaming for help because they're understandably worried about energy bills this coming winter. Plus, she may be a little bit more aggressive than some people were expecting. I think, myself included, thought that she may be all talk and very little happen. But a couple of early moves on moving things around in the UK Treasury and things, which are semi-controversial and quite aggressive, suggests she might be a stronger player than many thought. And to be able to do that, I don't say undercover, that's not a pleasant way of putting it, but whilst people are looking, much more to the new king and the burial of the Queen and everything, that may help her a bit. But as we know, honeymoons don't last long in politics, and the great Macmillan quote of events, dear boy, events. She's got her plans, but as we know, plans go awry quite quickly. So I think the interesting thing to see how much slack she's cut by people before, the knives are out. It'll be interesting to see.
Yeah, there's, I mean, prime ministers or presidents, they have power, but they have very little control over events, and that's going to be quite interesting. Speaking of events, I mean, there's almost going to be like a 2-week window here. My understanding, the funeral is not going to be to the 19th of September.
That's the day, possibly. It's not been, but probably. Yeah. So
it could even be, and just the amount of coverage. I've been quite shocked too by private for-profit corporations sending out messages of condolences or just respecting. Obviously, some great British brands like Aston Martin have said stuff, but I don't know. Is it appropriate for corporations to be?
I think it's, we live in a modern world. If you'd gone back 100 years, people would have put photographs in their windows with black ribbons in the front of shops and things. But a friend of mine was wandering around the West End this morning, really just to go and see the flowers at Buckingham Palace, and also went down Piccadilly, where there's a very famous grocery store, Fortnum and Mason, that's been going, some 300 years. They've blacked out all their windows. Totally.
Oh, wow.
And they've got a picture of the Queen and a short thank you message in one window. And it's very poignant. It's it's all very blacked out. And she was telling me that the atmosphere in the West End today was very flat. We've cancelled quite a few things like sports events and all this sort of stuff. And that, again, would have been much more common in the 50s. And I think for certainly people younger than me, it may seem almost slightly odd because we're just used to the idea that world rolls on. But she may just be one of these few people where the world does stop for a little while. So we'll see.
Well, it's probably a good thing, too, to have a pause. I mean, as before we got on the pod, you were saying that, Churchill was born in 1875, and Liz Truss was born in 1975, or like almost a 100-year span.
Yeah.
And that's, like the Queen is like a gateway to another century. I mean, it's hard to even comprehend what she has seen in her life, or,
she was,
we're living in this modern world, but yet, we're also living in the 1800s.
Yeah, I mean, I think actually, to be pedantic, I think Churchill was 1876, and the point was he was her first prime minister. But
right.
Maybe put it into an era focus. She was, what was she? She was late teens during the Second World War. And she kind of did a little bit of sort of army service for, I think, just the 1 year before the end of the war. Obviously, she wasn't involved in any armed combat, but it was kind of a proper job. And I think, as I remarked earlier before this, that you pretty much have to be over 80 to remember the previous king. So she's this fixture, and as you say, she had 1 foot pretty much in today's world. I think she's quite a modern person in many ways, but she did have 1 foot that goes back into a totally different age. And we kind of lose that now. And, the world moves on and all the rest of it. But whether it's a big seminal moment, I think it's difficult to say. It's a challenge for Prince Charles, because when Elizabeth became queen, she was an unknown quantity. She was a blank canvas. So in a way,
right,
that would be easier. Everybody in the world knows Prince Charles's views on architecture, ecology, life in general, how he's really upset about the Chinese and Nepal and all the rest of it. So in a way, he's kind of already, his positions are already laid out. And now under our system, the monarch is basically supposed to stay pretty quiet about things. And I think it'll be interesting to see if he resists the temptation to sort of say anything. I think he probably will resist the temptation, but we'll have to wait and see. If he doesn't, then we may start to have a problem where people say, well, hang on a moment, he's not elected, and, one thing and another. But I'm optimistic that it'll be fine.
No, that's a very keen observation, because you're right. He's been dabbling in various, environmental projects, rewilding, and, he's in his 70s, so he's had to find something to do. And
he's kind of an activist.
Right. No, he's very much an activist and advocating for policies he cares about. And now he steps into this role. And I was struck I heard Tony Blair say this, and Theresa May said this today in the comments, just that they both said when they had their weekly meeting with the Queen, they knew that was the only meeting on their schedule for the week that would not be leaked out immediately, and there was that quiet, the ability to speak to somebody who knew heads of states, maybe even knew their parents, going back. And I don't know, it'd be quite interesting to, in a democracy, I was thinking about our president. I mean, everybody he speaks to has an agenda. Like, there's really nobody outside of, their spouses who they can speak to. But having that kind of monarch that you can kind of check in on to share ideas or just chat, it's got to be pretty powerful.
It's the political equivalent of having a confessional with a priest, in a way.
Right.
And in the same way as that, I think it's a very powerful thing, because, if you are prime minister, and I know this is a terrible cliche, but to a degree, it is a lonely job. And other than your spouse, you've got maybe you can't trust your spouse, who knows? But you're right. Who the hell do you talk to? And so that must be valuable and useful. And of course, Prince Charles is the rather bizarre situation we've got is a new prime minister and a new monarch who've never held one of those meetings.
Yeah,
so it'll be a first for them both. So whether they'll combine, they'll sort of swap notes as to what's the best idea. I don't know. It'd be interesting.
Yeah, I think they're due to meet this afternoon. You're right. Like, what are they Do they say, okay, what do we do here? How do we do this? That'll be quite interesting.
So we're going to have a lot of focus on the UK for the next couple of weeks. And I know another of your favourite topics is soft power and all the rest of it. And I guess this illustrates the soft power of the monarchy, or again, of Queen Elizabeth. And we kind of see where that goes. Tributes.
The pageantry that you all are able to whip together, and the House of Windsor, Buckingham Palace. I mean, there'll be literally, I'm sure for sure there's already our top news correspondents are en route to London. There'll be wall-to-wall coverage. Just for the pageantry alone. So
other than that, things are a bit dull in England, really. There's nothing going on. Do you want to pick the ball up for other parts of the world? Or?
Yeah, no, I think you're right about the States. So we have a midterm election. We call it a midterm because it's between the election of the president. We have an election for a president every 4 years, but every 2 years there is another federal election. A third of our Senate, 100 members of the Senate, a third of them are up for election every 2 years, and the entire House of Representatives, all 435 members, are up for an election every 2 years. So this midterm election usually is almost a referendum. Historically, it's a check on the party in power, this being the Democrats this year. Typically, the party in power of the White House loses seats in both the Senate and the House of Representatives. The early betting line is that the Republicans will take the House of Representatives, but there's been a quite interesting resurgence. The silly season really benefited Biden. He got COVID and was off the grid for almost 10 days. There's some speculation him not being around has actually been quite helpful. But there's renewed energy in the Democrats that they may not do as bad in the House, and in fact, they may pick up a seat or two and keep the Senate, which would be quite dramatic. I mean, if Biden were to lose both branches or both chambers of the Hill, his agenda would automatically come to a screaming halt, even more so going into an election. So that's the current buzz. And sorry, go ahead, Gerald.
I say he's been fortunate with one or two things. I mean, I know nobody outside the States understands its relevance, but the gasoline price has been falling quite nicely during this period, hasn't it? So that's one less thing that you can blame on him, I guess. That may be a minor factor, but it doesn't hurt, I would have thought. And
then there's also, traditionally, we say that the election starts the day after Labor Day. So Labor Day was this Monday. So, I think we're like 61 days with 2 months maybe to the election. So it's a real sprint. It's going to get a lot of coverage, a lot of key races. Pennsylvania is going to be super interesting. Ohio is going to be super interesting. And then what's going to be, I think the other things listeners should pay attention to is promptly after the election in November, you're going to have people that are going to start saying, hey, I want to be president. They may even start declaring this year in December before Christmas, and certainly in early January, early February 2023. So the next 90 days is really hyperbolic, crazy time for democracy. A lot of fun if you're into politics.
Right. Well, the two kind of small bricks I'll chuck in the pond, one which is political and one which I think we need to watch, which is financial. But let's get the political one out of the way. Our dear friend, Donald Trump, where's he in all of this? Is he just screaming from the sidelines, or what do you think?
He too is like an old piece of luggage that will not go away and just absorbs a lot of attention. He's got endless amount of legal troubles, which has hurt him and also probably helped him. The thing about the Senate race is the inside baseball is a lot of the candidates that have won the primaries or that are at the top of the ticket, like Emmett Oz in Pennsylvania or Blake Masters in Arizona, J.D. Vance in Ohio, they are all kind of blessed by Trump. They're like Team MAGA, Team Trump. And this is a real situation where if these folks don't come through and the Republicans lose the Senate, a lot of the blame is going to come towards Trump's way. But I don't know. Trump is a relentless character. He's out there. I mean, he's absolutely does not care. He's just relentless. So
he's a disruptor, effectively, isn't he? I suppose.
He's a disruptor, and he just absorbs so much oxygen, so much attention. He's just a ball of fire. And compared to everybody else, I mean, they are just, the seven dwarfs. So Until he says he's not running, he's for sure the top candidate to be the Republican nominee in 2024.
So we watch this space. Now, this one is maybe not on many people's radar, and I, off the top of my head, can't remember the sources of this, but they're from some quite good economic commentators in the United States have pointed out that the domestic property market is starting to crack, and that the numbers of properties for sale in key wealthy states are coming off the market, and the price has been maybe stretched a lot over the last 18 months, 12 months, and that maybe there's a bit of trouble ahead in US property. Now, we can't always say that parallels are similar, but we know, obviously we all know what happened in 08, 09. I'm not saying the same again, but nevertheless, that may be a factor in 6 months to 1 year's time, I think.
100%. Like so many of our politically, so many of our elections are shaped by the economy. I mean, obviously, Bill Clinton famously, it's economy stupid. The housing situation obviously was a nightmare in 2008. We got way overextended. All these ninja loans. I don't know if the mortgages, the slowing down of the real estate has to do with the increased price of money, the interest rates going up. But there also does seem to be a general kind of malaise. Like there's just this weird, there isn't like a go-go feeling that we had during the internet boom. So much money sloshed around after COVID, all these crazy SPAC investments, VC money, Bitcoin money, the last few years, all that's kind of dried up. So I think there's just kind of a bit of a sobering reaction, a bit of a slowdown. But is it economically relevant, or I mean, is it more of a psychology? You know what I'm trying to say? Like the workforce, the unemployment rate, all these other numbers are really great, but there's almost the psychology of money, I think, is slowed down a bit.
And it's our old friend, the soft landing. What the Fed has to do is kind of get through this period of excess or exuberance is probably the wrong word.
Yeah, and as this is happening, as you know, the price of the dollar is just blowing up. I mean, it's exploding. Yeah. I mean,
I can't afford to ever come and see you. My God.
I know, it's my time to now buy some property in Europe. So I don't know. Like, to me, I'm much more interested in kind of psychology, and like the University of Michigan has this consumer sentiment that they measure. And, to me, it's interesting, not so much homes, but are people taking vacations? Are they traveling? Are they buying appliances? Is retail shopping up? A little bit more kind of day-to-day and, consumer sentiment. Do they feel good? If you plan a trip or a vacation, that generally indicates you feel positive that you can take this expenditure and go out there. So in some ways, the travel is a good thing to watch.
Yeah, I think you're right about employment, because, if you lose your job or you're fearful of losing your job, you're going to spend less money. It's as simple as that. And so whilst that remains quite strong, or very strong, as you point out, all well and good. And as I say, I think the Fed want to somehow land the other side of this period of excess without going into a recession. Now that's probably going to be more luck than judgment. I think it's very difficult to steer an economy looking forward. You're almost endlessly looking through the rear view mirror because of the data you've got. And some people are lucky at doing it, and some people have a feel for it. But it's not a given,
As an observer, I've always been struck about the amount of attention the Fed gets. And I know the bond market, I think, is 3 or 4 times bigger than the normal equity markets. And
it's huge market.
It's just massive. And I don't know, all the cool kids play in the bond market. But is the Fed, do they get too much attention? I mean, it just seems like such a boring place. And the ability to kind of control the market seems so futile, but it just gets so much attention.
Let me bore you a little bit more if anybody who wants to talk about bonds and monetary theory. Of course, the central banks can't actually influence long-term interest rates. They really only influence the short-term rates. If you're incredibly nerdy, you can look up a Swedish central banker from the 1930s called Vixel. That's already just halved our listenership, I think, by mentioning that. But the point is that they have to do these short-term tweaks, and an area that you and I are interested in, it's really about the human behavior that flows from that, rather than from those short-term signals. the movement of Fed fund rates. The risk normally with these guys is that they raise too much,
right,
and they miss it. And I have to say, I do think our dear friends at the European Central Bank may have fallen over the ball. I mean, they just suddenly bumped interest rates up by 75 basis points at the very moment, almost to the day, that there's signs that Europe is moving into recession. They've done this before. I think it was in 2005. And sure, it's very easy in the bar or on a program like this to criticize people who are trying to do it, but they have been spectacularly bad with their timing. So I think there's a lot of storms ahead in finance and the economies in general, really.
I suppose too, like, how old are how old would you say central banks are? When did they become really relevant? I mean, for me, my interest in this stuff really became after kind of World War II, Bretton Woods, establishing the World Bank. And I mean, they're relatively new, correct? I mean, it's not like...
The Fed they had a couple of goes at it in the early days of the United States, but I think a Fed got going in something like 1910. I'm open to correction, but it's that sort of order. Most central banks started as a way of trying to get money out of the taxpayers by issuing bonds. So the English were at it very early on, although it was the Scotsmen who kicked off the Bank of England. Again, I'm going to get my dates wrong. It's certainly in the late 1600s, 1690s, something. But you're right. I think really where central banks became very important was when the dollar came off the gold standard in 71. Because now a lot of fixed reference points became floating ones. And, that a load of pent-up volatility started, and we had all sorts of fun and games in the markets, really, for the next 20 or 30 years.
Well, it would be wonderful just to do a whole chat about Nixon and economic monetary policy, and, like the famous quote, "We're all Keynesians now." And, they instituted price controls. At one point, Nixon had a board that was trying to figure out the price of dry cleaning. I mean, can you imagine putting smart people in a room to figure out what the price of a dry clean shirt should cost? I mean, it's it's just so crazy.
Yeah, a completely Soviet way. We had exactly the same thing in the mid-70s in the UK, because there's this public demand for certainty, and there's this public demand that the government must sort it out. And that kind of segues into where we are with energy pricing, where people are saying, look, there's no way I can pay this gas bill or electricity bill. Excuse me. So the government's going to have to sort it out. Well, they can't always do so.
That should be on a bumper sticker. They can't always do so. Speaking of, I want to talk about Xi. You're right. His, I think the party conference starts the 16th of October, which is will be 5 weeks away. What about Gorbachev? Do you have any thoughts on his passing? I mean, another kind of lion, huge historic figure. Also, I think somebody who's severely shaped Xi Jinping's thinking, the Communist Party's thinking. Any thoughts on Gorbachev?
Isn't there a quote? Somebody somebody distinguished like yourself made this quote, but that Gorbachev's latter career was Xi's nightmare. And, Gorbachev essentially tried to semi-loosen a very rigid system, and you just can't do that. Once you just kind of let a little bit of light into the system, it just kind of blows up. And that's exactly what happened under Gorbachev with perestroika and everything. They couldn't do a controlled way. What's interesting about China is they've managed to split the economy from the political. So you've got this situation under Deng Xiaoping where 1,000 flowers can bloom and all the rest of it. And you can go off and you can create your garment factory or car factory, but don't you go within a mile of politics. And of course, one or two people who now we've almost forgotten about stood over that line. The one that comes to mind is Jack Ma. I mean, Jack Ma was this very assertive, probably far too publicly political. Yeah. And the Communist Party came in and said, well, we don't care how many billions of dollars you're worth. You're off the pitch. You're off the pitch. And so I think China have got by separating those two things, which they weren't able to do in the Soviet Union, Xi probably has a better chance of keeping a lid on it. But,
well, in the military as well, which I don't think enough people in the West fully appreciate. I mean, the party is above the state. That is the judicial system, the People's Liberation Army. They all report to the party. They don't report to the state. There's no constitution that is guiding them. The party is guiding them. So reining in the PLA has been one of Xi's great triumphs, and that's something that Gorbachev, didn't really get a hold of, and that really led to one of his downfalls. And Xi has learned a lot of lessons. I mean, there's no doubt the Chinese Communist Party is not a big fan of 1989 and the wall falling down by any stretch of the imagination.
No, I would agree. I mean, I think, again, we were talking about big figures earlier. Gorbachev is a if you're writing a history of the 20th century, he's an extraordinarily important figure, certainly against the doddery old fools that came before him, some of whom were sort of barely sentient. But of course, it's the old phrase, isn't it? A prophet is never honored in his own land. And he was, and I guess his memory now, was widely hated in Russia. And there's a whole political stream that Putin has tapped into, that this whole breakup of the Soviet Union was a disaster, and that we've got to get back to where we were in 1989. And I think that's a big mainspring of what drives Putin, actually.
There's two great commercial activities, like capitalistic activities that Gorbachev participated in. If you haven't seen it, there's a great, he was a spokesperson for Pizza Hut. Pizza Hut opened a store in Moscow. There's an ad with him. There's this great photo. He sold Louis Vuitton bags, like he's driving around Berlin with a Louis Vuitton bag. And there was this great quote. Gorbachev was due to meet with the diplomat. He was running late, and Gorbachev apologized to the diplomat, and the diplomat said, "What was the problem?" And he's like, "Oh, there's an agricultural issue, he had to deal with." And the diplomat was like, "Oh, what's the problem?" And Gorbachev said, 1917. That is, this problem has been going on because the Communist Party took over. I don't know. Does he seem quite to be had some wit about him?
Well, we on this podcast, we've always banged the drum. The gentleman called Tim Marshall and his ideas that geography shapes politics, and politics comes and goes, but the geography of Russia or Greater Russia, and for that matter of China and Chinese influence in the Pacific, doesn't go away. It'll ebb and flow, whoever the leaders are. I don't know, I guess he will cement his position, and out of somewhere, a new name none of us have heard of will suddenly appear as well. So the whole thing will go around. But to me, the Communist Party of China look absolutely rock solid at the moment. That may be a famously bad quote to have just made there. Maybe there'll be a big change. But there's no sign of it at all. They seem to have got a pretty strong handle on things.
Well, it does seem either he's going to be there for another 30 years or he's going to be there for another 30 months, right? I mean, it does seem like... Yeah,
that's...
Has he figured it out? I mean, I just can't imagine. It was before we came on. I mean, governments are human institutions. I just can't imagine there's that many guys in Shanghai that are like, we got to listen to this guy for another 2 decades. I mean...
Well, I mean, there's some good documentary series on Netflix. This isn't what we're watching one, but there's some great ones on the 5 mafia families of New York. And, they basically spent most of their time killing one another. And because it's in the nature of these guys that you're always worried about the guy who's just standing behind you. And I'm sure that must be true in all these sort of political setups.
Well, Bo Xilai is a character we shall look at. I mean, before she took power, 8 years ago, I don't know, Bo Xilai was moved on. But he's still alive. He's still there. He's been arrested, but I don't know. You're still, as long as you're alive, you're still in the game in China.
Well, now talking about maybe getting back in the game, and we won't waste too much time on it, but I know a lot of people talk about Boris coming back. He's only just gone. He did give a very good speech in the House of Commons today, but then that's what you and I are expecting. We're expecting him to write brilliant articles, really good speeches, but maybe we shouldn't let him actually run anything. People tried to compare him to other people, and it just struck me the other day that this is again maybe slipped in people's memory a bit, but Boris is very much like the British Prime Minister David Lloyd George. Lloyd George was a very big figure in the successful execution of the First World War. as much as you can say it was successful from Britain's point of view, because we pretty much went bankrupt. But he certainly organised things a lot better. But he sort of went left field in the 20s and 30s, and was shouting from, as a respected statesman, he was shouting from the sidelines and became very pro-Hitler. Now, I'm not saying Boris is very pro-North Korea, but he became a loose cannon, and so I think you're right that Boris is going to be a long-term loose cannon, but mainly speaking in Las Vegas.
Well, what's interesting about Boris is that he's only relevant, and his book sales and his speeches are only going to be interesting if he is seen as a future prime minister again, right? I mean, he's done nothing to say, I'm never doing this again. The speculation of him being there, him being a better orator than Liz Truss, he needs that mythology, right? I mean, he needs to be seen as the next prime minister.
But his problem is the British parliamentary system. He can't do a Trump. He can't be an outsider and run for president. He's never going to be in a commanding position of any party, I don't think, in the House of Commons to become leader again. So it's a no-go. If we had a presidential system, I'm sure he'd be on the next ticket. I'm sure.
I disagree, man. I give it a 45% chance, which is kind of a lame answer to say 45%, but I don't know. There's something about Boris. I think, in some ways, he knows the job better now. He's ready. He just needs a little break, make some cash.
No, he's lazy, incompetent. He's very entertaining.
Well, he may be lazy and incompetent. That doesn't mean he's not going to be the next prime minister. No,
this is your cynical view on politicians in general, isn't it?
No, I think you're demanding too much of prime ministers. I mean, come on. There's been how many prime ministers have there been? I mean, hundreds.
No, it's not that many. It's about 70 or so. Probably too many. So, do we get to your favourite part of the show at the end?
I'm ready. What we're reading and watching. Have you been entertaining yourself as you're on the mend and visiting physios? Have you been watching stuff or reading?
Yeah, basically trying to avoid physios as much as possible. This is sort of some form of legalized torture. But I have been fairly well behaved on that front. But it has given me a chance to sort of slide around the bookshelves, and I've come up with one which, again, maybe to English viewers would be better known, or English readers, which is a book of poetry. I thought we'd try and raise.
Oh, how regal of you! How confidential.
Let's try and raise the game here a bit. So it's Summoned by Bells, and it is by the famous British poet John Betjeman. And John Betjeman became poet laureate, and he's a very, very popular figure still in English literature. And for people who aren't interested in poetry, he did some great films on British country life and everything in the 1960s and 70s. You'll find him on YouTube. And I'm very delighted to see that this book, which somebody gave me a few years ago, is a first edition. I don't think it's worth a fortune, but I'm obviously going to say it's worth a fortune, but it's probably got billions printed. But it's from 1960. It's Summoned by Bells, and it's a kind of famous anthology of poetry.
I feel like I should be wearing some tweed.
Thank you for that. Down the other end of the scale of things, let's talk Michael Caine.
Okay.
And, again, just a chance sort of ranging around a bit on Netflix. I came across a film which I think is very well known with Michael Caine, but I've never seen it. It's one called Dirty Rotten Scoundrels, and it's a comedy with him and Steve Martin.
Oh my, yeah, it's absolutely brilliant. It's absolutely fantastic.
Brilliant, and it seemed to pass me by. And
it still holds up. It's a really great movie.
Yeah, no, I recommend that. I have to say, I think Michael Caine's output, and like I know what I'm talking about, but it's been mixed. He's done some fantastic films, and he's done some which I think he's readily admitted in public he did for the money and aren't very good. But this is a very funny film, and as you say, I don't know, it's probably 25 years old, maybe a bit more now.
Yeah, I know. I think you're probably right. It's definitely a few decades old for sure.
Yeah, but it feels fresh and modern, and one of those rare things where you laugh out loud, so it's very good. So that's me.
Yeah, it's almost a how-to to live in the south of France. I mean, it's good stuff.
Yeah. what a perfect gig to get to do a film in the south of France.
I know. I was thinking about it, like Kane and Steve Martin. They're like, listen, we're going to send you to the south of France. It's going to be a comedy. Are you in? Yes.
We would say the same if we got an offer to the south.
100%. I have 2 books for you. This is Fuzzy Tech, which is a few years old now, but basically making the case that, the liberal arts are helpful for learning technology, which I think we both appreciate, just the human behavior, the psychology behind it. So it's a good little fun book. It reads kind of like a long Wired article, so not too heavy reading, but a good book. And then a deeper book, about a third of the way through, is Wired for War, which is all about the future, and in some ways, the modern battlefield, just the amount of tech, really going to have less and less humans on the battlefield per se, but more and more robots, droids, all kinds of weird technology that are going to shape the future, and just how important computer chips are and technology. So a good mix here of kind of the psychology of tech from more the consumer side, but really the need for really heavy physics and chemistry and serious computer science on the battlefield. So,
and isn't it fair to say in the history of technology, it's often driven by military spending? That the military spending then leads to all sorts of spin-offs in the commercial world.
Correct.
The driver comes from sort of government demands for this. And although I'm a sort of, Reading Claw sort of capital markets type, I think everybody has to admit that a large part of defense spending can be a big sort of entrepreneurial boost into many industries. And
no, spot on. And actually, I've got 2 things. If you're not familiar with DARPA, which is the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, it's part of the Department of Defense. You can kind of nerd out on that. It's kind of the skunk works of the Pentagon, where kind of crazy stuff is happening. And actually, our upcoming Brigadoon monthly call in a few weeks' time on the 21st, we're having Susan Zern, who is part of this nonprofit that works with academia, entrepreneurs, and kind of national security, and a kind of Venn diagram of getting these different folks together to talk about the future of tech. So but DARPA is a super interesting organization. A lot of good stuff comes out of there, and it's pretty exciting. I guess there was a Minuteman missile test this week too in California.
And did I dream it, or is there also a new defense initiative with Saudi Arabia as well? Yeah,
no, I spotted that. The US Air Force is trying to set up some kind of innovative something or other base in Saudi Arabia. I don't know. The world keeps moving, and it is interesting to watch the military, and you can get a little hung up on the industrial complex of it, but they're certainly at the forefront of tech and creating some kind of weird, exciting stuff.
So there we go. As usual, you're at the cutting edge with the technology, and I'm in my tweeds, metaphorically looking.
No, I think I'd much rather be reading poetry in the Cotswolds than wearing tweeds. That sounds much more lovely.
Good stuff.
Well, Gerald, thank you very much. I'm glad you're feeling better, and we'll see you in a few weeks. We got some guests coming up, and we got an exciting fall. We get the Italian election, the Brazilians, the Chinese, the U.S., and as always, the House of Commons.
Yeah. Watch this space to see what happens next. Lord knows.
Watch this space. We'll see you soon. Thanks.
Take care. Bye-bye.